All right, well, thank you everybody for joining my session today. We are going to talk about how you can turn any content into an engaging scenario. My name is Nicole Legault, and I'll just start by introducing myself. You might be wondering what kind of name is Legault. It is French-Canadian. That is where I'm visiting from, Ottawa, Canada. It's my first time here in Chicago. Loving this city so far. I'll just introduce myself a little bit. I am a community manager for the e-learning software company Articulate. They are the makers of Storyline and Studio. Some of you may know these products. They're also home to the eLearning Heroes community, the biggest e-learning community on the web. There's over 350,000 registered members. That is what I do as a community manager, is I manage that community. So I'm writing articles, creating content, downloads and templates. So if you don't already know about the eLearning Heroes community, I strongly urge you to check it out, because there's lots of great assets for instructional designers and e-learning developers. So I have a background in e-learning development and instructional design. And so what I do as a community manager is I use that experience to help our community members create awesome e-learning. And so on that note, you might be wondering, what exactly is awesome e-learning? I don't think there's exactly one definition. Everybody's kind of got a different idea of what is awesome e-learning for them. But I think we can all agree that if it's interesting, if it's engaging, if it's relevant, and if it's meaningful for the learner, then you're probably well on your way to having some awesome e-learning. And one way that you can do that, make it engaging and interesting and relevant, is by adding scenarios to your courses. So that's what we are going to be talking about today. And before I start, I'd just like to do a quick poll and find out who here feels confident right now designing and developing a scenario for e-learning. If you feel confident in doing it right now, raise your hand. Okay, so we got a couple scenario experts in here already, I see. I just like to do this at the start just to kind of get a gauge for where the classroom is at, and at the end I'm going to do the same poll and then see, hopefully more hands will be up at the end, so it's a good way for me to see if I got through to some of you. So here's what I'm going to be covering in my session today. First, we're going to talk about what is a scenario, quick definition. We're going to look at a few examples of some scenarios online, so we're all on the same page about exactly what it is that we're talking about today. Quickly, we'll go over why you would want to use scenarios. Scenarios take a little bit more time to build and develop than your regular just click next and go kind of course. So if you are going to be building them, you might want to have some good reasons as to why you should invest that extra time into building the scenarios. But we're not going to focus too much on those first two bullet points, because the most important thing here, the meat and potatoes of this session, is really the 6-step scenario process, where we're going to walk through building a scenario in 6 steps together. I really think that the best way to learn something is to do it yourself, and we're kind of limited in our ability to do that in this session format. But we're going to do the next best thing, which is we're going to walk through it together with me. We're going to build a scenario slide from scratch to a completed slide. And I'll ask you for your input for a few things along the way, so hopefully it'll be interactive. And if you have questions along the way, feel free to just put your hand up. I'm happy to answer all your questions. And after we go through this 6-step scenario process, I'm just going to wrap up with a little bit of talk about branching. You may have heard of branched scenarios before, and you might be wondering, what is that? How do I do that? So we're going to touch on branching a little bit at the end as well. So let's start off by just going over what is a scenario. So if you look in the dictionary, or if you Googled the word scenario, there'd be a couple of definitions of it. One is a sequence or a development of events, synonyms being a storyline, a plot, a framework. And another definition would be a background or a context or a scene. And when we're talking about e-learning scenarios, we're kind of mixing both of these definitions. We want to set the background, we want to set the context and the scene, and within that we're going to incorporate a series of questions, a series of events that the learners are going to ask. So the next thing I want to show you is a couple of examples. So I'm just going to jump over to the web here. So I have 2 examples of some scenarios. These are both branch scenarios that I want to show you. They're both created with Articulate Storyline. So this is one that I created called the job interview. Obviously, it's about doing a job interview. So you put in your name and the place where you want to work. Then we get a little introduction to our scenario, and we have a meter here along the bottom, which goes up or down depending on how you're doing, how you're answering the questions, and how the interviewer feels about you. So if we just jump in, you'll see we have our first question. And now depending on how I answer this, the scenario can either last for one question or it can go on for up to 10 or 12 questions depending how it goes. So if I leave too late for my interview, say I choose this option right here, you'll notice that right away I failed. I'm 25 minutes late. I don't get the job. It's over. So that branch of the scenario kind of ends right there. See, sorry, you didn't get the job. Aw. But if I try again and I answer correctly, you'll see when I answer correctly, the meter goes up. And you'll see that when I answer correctly, her facial expression is positive, right? And she seems happy. The progress meter is going up. So now, not so impressed. Not so impressed with my answer here. And depending on how you answer, certain questions lead off to like a certain branch of questions. Like if you mentioned that you're an award-winning e-learning designer, then it kind of branches off into where she asks you about the award, and then you have a chance to get more points. So depending on how you answer the questions, the outcome is different. You have a chance to get more points. So it's really a different experience for everyone who goes through the course, and it can be different every time you do it depending on how you answer. So I'm going to jump over to another example here. So this is also created with Storyline. So if I just jump in, I can type my name. And this is a nice way to personalize your scenarios, like letting users put in their name, letting them choose an avatar. So here I can pick, which character is going to represent me in my scenario. So I'll just pick her. I choose, what scenario I want to do, and then I get a little introduction to my scenario. So I'll be helping a customer with the billing question. And here we go. Thanks for calling. How can I help you? And then we have our customer who comes in with her question. And now depending on how I answer, you'll see that the background right now is blue behind the customer. It's kind of neutral. And if I answer incorrectly, it starts to turn orange and then red, and she gets pretty unhappy with me. And if I really get her mad, you can see things are really not going well here. And now she's just completely frustrated with me, and she's going to cancel her service. So this is not a really good outcome. I didn't really do too well this time. But if I do this again, just to show you how it's different depending on the choices that I make, I will just continue here. And these, both of these scenarios actually are available as free templates in our community if you wanted to repurpose these, just to mention that. So this time I'm going to just make a couple of right selections so that you can see how things go if I don't, lose the customer. So I'm just going to choose this and see how it's turning green, and she's get her positive facial expression. So you can see how, depending on how you answer the questions, depending on what you do, the outcome of the scenario is going to change. So that's a couple of examples of e-learning scenarios. So I just wanted to show that so that we can all kind of make sure we're on the same page about what it is that I'm talking about when I'm talking about scenarios. So as I mentioned, creating a scenario is going to be a little bit more time consuming than just putting your text in bullet points on a slide and having a click next button. So if you need to convince your boss or your client that scenarios are the way to go, you're probably going to want to mention a couple of these points as to why they're worthwhile. First of all, scenarios are going to make your content a lot more interesting and engaging. Whenever a learner is just reading text and clicking next, there's not a whole lot of engagement happening. Whenever you're creating a scenario, you are making them think about what they would really do on the job, and you're making them think about what the real life situation would be. So that's going to be a lot more interesting for them. It's also more meaningful and relevant because you're putting them into the real life context that they're going to be facing on the job. So that's going to be more meaningful to them than just presenting static text on a slide. You're making them think through the decisions that they're going to have to make. Also, I think that you'll find that you have much more of a business impact when you turn your e-learning into scenarios. The reason I say that is most of the time when we're creating training, it's because there's a performance gap or there's a business need. We're not just, for the most part, creating training just for the heck of it. We're creating the training because there's a business need that we need to fill. And when people are just reading text on a slide and then doing a multiple choice or a true or false quiz, you don't really know if they know how to do their jobs. You just know that they were able to memorize, the information and pass the test. But when you put your content into the format of a scenario, when they pass that scenario at the end, you know that they actually know how to make the right decisions that they're going to have to make back on the job. So you're more likely to have a business impact at the end of the day. A couple other reasons that you might want to consider scenarios. Characters really draw people in. There's been some studies done of websites where with eye tracking mechanisms that show that if there's faces on the screen, people tend to look right away at the faces. People are drawn to people. So using characters can really draw in your learners and engage them that way. Also, having a storyline or a plot or a theme that kind of unifies all of your content, that's a good way to kind of tie everything together with a nice little bow and unify your whole course. So those are a couple other reasons that, scenarios are worthwhile. So enough about that, though. I think we want to jump into the most important part, which is how to actually build an e-learning scenario. So I'm going to walk you through my 6-step process that I follow for building scenarios. What we're going to do is we're actually going to take this slide here. So this is our before slide. This is actually just a PowerPoint slide with some shapes on it and some text. So we're going to go from this and we're going to turn it into this together. We're going to walk through this and we're going to take a boring blank slide and we're going to turn it into like a fully fleshed out scenario slide. And we're going to go through this step by step. So jumping right in, the first step to building your scenario is going to be to identify real life opportunities to apply the knowledge. So what this means is that whenever we're giving people training, we're trying to give them knowledge and skills, right? And what you want to do is you want to think about what are the situations that the learner is going to face in real life where they're going to have to apply the knowledge and skills that they're learning in the training course. We're usually not just teaching people just for the heck of it. Like they're going to have to apply that somewhere on the job down the line. That's why we're teaching them this information. So the first thing you want to do is you want to identify when are they going to need to use this information? What's the situation going to be, right? So if you can't think of the situation, you might want to speak with your subject matter expert. So just to let you guys know up front, your subject matter experts are probably going to help you a lot when you're building out your scenarios because they're going to help you with all the details, all the realistic stuff that you need to know to make this as meaningful as possible for your learner. So in some cases, you might not have a subject matter expert. You might be the SME yourself. But if you're not and you're wondering, like, where do I get this information? I don't know. Then your subject matter expert's going to be your best friend. So treat them well because they can really help you out with this. So the first thing you do is you identify real opportunities to apply the knowledge. Let's talk real quick about a couple of common types of training and how you can turn it into scenarios. So soft skills is a common topic that we build training for. Soft skills is like emotional intelligence, communication skills, and they're often a lot harder to train on because, training someone how to communicate effectively, that's harder than teaching someone how to change a tire on a car, right? Changing a tire on a car has this very, laid out process. First you do this, then you do that. It's very structured, it's easy to follow, it's the same for everyone every time. But communicating effectively is a lot more nuanced. It's not quite as clear cut in terms of what the process is for doing that. But soft skills training actually lends itself really, really well to scenarios. As you saw in the example that I showed at the start with the interviewing scenario, interviewing skills are a soft skill, right? And putting them into the format of a scenario is a really good way to test that out. Compliance is also another type of training that can really be made into scenarios quite easily. I've often heard people say, oh, compliance training, it's so dry, it's so dull, there's no way that I can make this exciting. But I actually think that there's a lot of opportunities there when it comes to, for example, health and safety training. Say you're building a course on fire safety for the workplace. Instead of just giving your learners a checklist of here's what you do in case of a fire, you can build that into an interesting scenario. It's Tuesday morning, the fire alarm goes off, what do you do? And then, your choices would be, what they do next, and one of them would obviously be, you know, what the SOP or like what the, you know, what the procedure calls for. And then you can even include something like, oh, you didn't follow the right step and now you're locked in the building and the building burns down, which might be a little bit dramatic. That's a bit dramatic, yes, but just to show you how like that's gonna have more of an impact on your learner if you put them in that situation and give them that feedback instead of just presenting them with a list of bullet points. So compliance training is also a type of training where you can really have fun with scenarios. Finally, product training. We've all seen, you know, PowerPoint decks with like all this product information, facts and figures. We've all, you know, turned it into a nice PowerPoint with nice images where we point out the different features, and like that's all nice and pretty to do that, but at the end of the day, building it into a scenario allows you to really test your learner on, do they know how to apply that knowledge about the products on the job, because that's what you want them to do at the end of the day, right? So, and that's actually what we're going to be building out together, is going to be an example of a scenario for some product training. So we're going to say that we are a training designer for a company called Pharma Inc. Okay, and the sales manager comes to us one day with this boring, ugly PowerPoint slide, and he says, here's this new product that we have, here's the information, turn this into an engaging e-learning course. Anybody ever been there before? Yeah, this is actually a real project that I did a couple years back. So we have this slide now, we have this new product, and we have to think of a way to turn this into a fun scenario for our learners. So this is what we're going to do together. So the first thing we want to do is, like I just mentioned, step one is you want to identify the real-life opportunity to apply the knowledge. So what situation do you guys think would require the sales associates at Pharma Inc. to apply the knowledge about the new product? Like when would they need to, if they're learning about this new product, what situations would they encounter where they actually need to use that information? Yep. That's right. I heard a lot of people mention a sales call, right? So that is the scenario right there. They're going to need to know about the product when the customers call in and ask about the product. That's when they're going to need to know all this information. That's when they're going to need to pull out the facts and the figures and all this features about the product to be able to sell it to the customer, right? So we've actually already done step one of creating a scenario, which is we've identified the real life opportunity to apply the knowledge. So sometimes it's really obvious, like for example, if you're training someone on interviewing skills, obviously where they're going to apply the knowledge is going to be in an interview, right? So sometimes it's really obvious to you. Other times it might not be so obvious. That's when you want to talk with your subject matter expert and really find out what are those real life situations going to be. So as I fill out this template, you'll notice that the title is in red. As I go through this, each step that I do is going to be in red. So right now, what we've done is we've identified the real life opportunity. So I filled out the first part of my template with handling a customer sales call, because that's going to be the situation. So the next thing that we want to do, step two in building your scenario, is you want to think in terms of decision making. So when the learners are faced with that situation, they're handling a customer sales call, what are some of the decisions that they're going to have to make on the job, right? They're going to have to, one of the decisions they're going to have to make in this example is they're going to have to think of what to say to the customer, right? They're going to have to think of what is the right information to give them, what product features should I tell them about, depending on the customer. And this is where I let you guys in on a big secret about scenarios, which is that scenarios are actually multiple choice questions. That's all they are. At the end of the day, it's a multiple choice question, right? It seems like they're super complicated. No, it's a multiple choice question. Just the way that you structure the question and the wording of it is what makes it a scenario. So your question is actually a problem or a decision or a challenge that your learners are going to face on the job. And your choices are going to be possible courses of action or possible things that they could do when they're faced with that situation. So when it comes down to it, it's actually just a multiple choice question. So if I pop in my challenge and my choices into my template, you'll see that it's already starting to really come together here. So a couple things I want to mention about when you're building out your choices. First of all, I think it's good to have at least 3 choices. There's been a couple of times where I built scenarios and I really was only able to have 2 choices because I couldn't come up with like a third plausible incorrect choice. Because the key to having good choices is to have, of course, a correct choice, but for your incorrect choices to be realistic and plausible. If you're just going to have an obvious correct answer and the other two choices are like silly things that no one would actually really do in real life, don't even bother taking the time to build a scenario, because you're basically giving your learner the answer. You're not making them think, right? One thing that I think is a good idea to do when you're filling out your choices is to talk to your subject matter expert about what are some common mistakes that people make. Like when a customer calls in with a question, are there things that sales reps do often that's wrong, that they shouldn't do? Do they sometimes give misinformation? Try to incorporate those mistakes and those common errors into your choices as the wrong choices. Then it's more realistic for your learner, right? And your subject matter expert will probably be able to help you with that. And when it comes to selecting your choices, like I said, I think having 3 is ideal. I think that's really like the magic number. But if you choose to have 2, or if you want to have 4, I think you should just be consistent throughout your whole course with the amount of choices that you have. So if your first question has 3 choices, have all of your questions have 3 choices. Don't go 3 choices, then 2 choices, then 4. Like, just be consistent with the amount that you choose throughout your whole entire course. And I have to tell you guys that creating the choices is probably going to be one of the most challenging parts of creating your scenarios. Speaking from experience, this is the most time-consuming part, is crafting good choices that are wrong. It's hard sometimes to come up with realistic things that people might do, but that are not correct. So this is probably going to be what's going to challenge you the most when you're creating your scenario, is coming up with these choices. And now something else that I want to mention is that before you let your learner jump into the scenario, I would always let them review the product information first, because it's not really fair to send your learner into this scenario and expect them to just know that, you know, that the reduced rate of infection is 80%. Like, they're not just going to know that unless you gave them a chance beforehand to review your product information. So you can still have that nice slide with the images and the features and all that stuff. You still want to have that, but you want to present that up front and then let them go into the scenario where they can apply that knowledge in the real life context. So that's just something important to think about. You don't want to quiz your learners on content that you haven't presented to them yet, right? Yes?
Are there any good times when you can use scenarios to build context?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, before providing the information.
Yes, yeah, I think you can. I think it's just important to not have graded quiz questions before you present the information. I've had scenarios that weren't graded, where they have to make the selections. But if you don't present the information beforehand, I would just make sure that it's not graded, or that it's just kind of contextual information, as opposed to like the stuff that you're going to quiz them on for real. Because then it's just not really fair to the learner if they're being quizzed and they haven't had a chance to find out that information ahead of time. But yeah, I think you can build the scenario around it and kind of have a few pre-questions, then present the content. Yeah, that is an option for sure. So now you can see that our template's kind of coming together. We have our situation, we have our challenge, we have a couple of choices that we've presented them with. So now the next thing that we want to do is select our characters for our scenario. So characters are a really important part of your scenario. They're kind of the backbone of your whole scenario, because they're the actors that are going to be playing out your scenario from start to finish. And when I say use appropriate characters, I really mean relatable characters. And a way that you can make sure that you choose relatable characters is by making sure that you do your audience analysis up front. So as instructional designers and e-learning developers, you're probably all familiar with audience analysis. You know, usually we do that in the first part, you know, of ATDChi. During the analysis, one of the things we analyze is our audience. And the reason we do that is we need to know who our learners are to be able to create content that's going to work well for them, right? If we're building an e-learning course for super tech-savvy engineers who work on the computer all day, you can expect that they're going to be a little bit more familiar navigating through an e-learning course or figuring out how to do that. But if your audience is, you know, people who work in a manufacturing facility who have no technical knowledge at all and who are not familiar with computers and don't use computers every day, you're probably going to need to be a lot more prescriptive, you know, give more instructions, be really clear on what they have to do, because they're going to be less comfortable with, you know, the technology. So knowing who your learners are is really important, and the way to do that is with your audience analysis. So let's say that, we're the training designer at Pharma Inc. and we've been handed this project. So we did an audience analysis and we're building this for the sales reps at Pharma Inc. And we found out that, the typical sales rep at this company is a male, between 30 and 40. So that's say the majority of the employees, that's what they are. That being the case, if you were going to choose a character to play the sales rep in your scenario, you'd probably want to choose a male who's between 30 and 40, because that way it's going to be most relevant and most meaningful for the majority of your learners, right? If you pick like a 15-year-old girl, they're not going to relate to that quite as much as if you pick a character that represents them. As you saw in the e-learning example that I showed of the customer call center example, you were able to choose your character up front. So that's kind of a way that you can alleviate that, if you can give them options and let them choose the character that works best for them. You saw that for me, I picked the woman because people just tend to pick the character that represents them the most. So that's one way that you can make sure that you have characters that work for all of your audience. But if you don't want to do that, just try to pick characters that that most people will relate to. So let's say that in our example for Pharma Inc., we talked to our subject matter expert and we said, who's the typical customer? Who would call and ask questions about this product, this new product that we're selling? And our SME says, surgeons, doctors are usually the people who call us to find out about this product, specifically, bone graft surgeons, because this is a product that works for bone grafting. Again, this was a real project that I did. So let's say that we want to have a surgeon be the character in our scenario. So here's a couple characters. Which character do you think best represents a surgeon for this scenario? Who thinks A? Right. Anybody think B? No, obviously not. C, anyone? C could potentially be a character, but I purposely picked a girl who looks like she's 18 and is holding a notebook in her arms. So she kind of, has the air of a student. And to become a bone graft surgeon, that's probably got to be a good, 10 to 12 years of schooling to get there. So she kind of looks a little young to be there. So, probably A in this case would be the best choice to represent our surgeon in our scenario. So this is what I mean about just picking the character that's going to work best with your content. It's an important part of your scenario.
Question?
Yes?
I'm not familiar with Articulate, so are these images built into a library?
Yes. Yes. A and C are characters that you get when you buy Storyline. You get 8 characters, and A and C are 2 of those 8 characters that come in 150 poses each, and they are in the library in the software. B.
So for those of us who use something else besides Articulate, not to belittle the product you're using, what are some suggestions of libraries that we can go to?
Well, Articulate, you can also buy the characters separate from the product. You can go to the store and just buy these characters, even if you don't have the software. Okay. You can buy them from the Articulate store and then use them in any, in PowerPoint or in Captivate or Lectora, whatever it is that you're using. You can purchase the characters and use them there. Then there's lots of other options. eLearning Brothers is a company that I know a lot of people use that have a lot of assets. They have tons of characters that you can purchase there as well that come in hundreds of different poses. And then if you keep an eye out on the free sites, sometimes they'll give away a couple poses of a character. So just there's lots of different options out there if you're not using Storyline.
Okay, thank you.
And then B, just so you know, B doesn't come with Storyline, but is available in the store if you wanted to purchase her. So now back to my template. Now you'll see that I've added in my picture of my character. And in this scenario, I'm just using one character. I'm just using an image of my customer. But I could also, if I wanted to, have the character representing the sales rep on the screen too. So you could have multiple characters, depending on what you want to do. But yeah, so now we have our character in place. So the next step that I want to talk about for building out your scenario is setting the context for your scenario. And by setting the context, what I really mean by this is adding a background image. That's really all there is to it in terms of setting the context. I always try to use background images of physical locations in all of my e-learning that are relevant to what the person is going to be doing in the scenario. You'll see that even this presentation that I'm giving, notice the background is a computer. because that's where you're going to be when you're building a scenario, right? You're going to be at your computer. So that's why I chose that as the background image for this. So I try to always use a background image that is representative of the physical location where they're going to be applying the knowledge and skills that they're learning. So sometimes that's really easy. You know right away where that is. Other times you might have to talk with your subject matter expert for them to let you know about this information. So here I'm going to show you guys a couple examples of how much of an impact using a background image can have for your scenario. So here we have just the template slide like I showed you at the start, just plain template, just some shapes with text and our character. Now notice how when I pop in this background image of an office space, it really gives a lot more context. It really starts to bring the scenario to life because now we know, oh, this is happening in an office building. This is an office themed, scenario. And one thing I want you to notice is how faded out the background image is. I do this on purpose and I do this almost all the time because see what happens when I don't fade out the background image? What happens is that the background image is really competing for attention with our character and our text. And we don't want that. We want our text and our question to really stand out on the slide. We don't want our eye to be confused about where to look or what's the most important thing that we're looking at here. The question is the key thing that we want to stand out. So that's why I almost always apply this like faded transparency effect to my images. I like to make it just light enough so that you can still see it, so you still get like the essence of the image and you still know where they are, but light enough so that it's not overpowering your slide like it would be here. And now notice that I use like shapes behind the text so that I can still read the text clearly on top of the image. There's lots of different techniques that you can use for overlaying text on images. I have an article that I wrote about it, 7 ways to overlay text on images. Shapes is one way. If we look here, I'll show you that we have a scenario. This is like warehouse safety scenario. So we have our character with the hard hat. And now see how when we add the warehouse image in the background, it just totally changes the slide and really brings it to life and really makes us aware that this is a warehouse situation. And you'll notice that this time, the box at the top, I applied the faded transparency effect to the rectangle across the top as well, so that you can still see the image through it. So that's something that I do also. And now here's one more example. We have like a travel scenario. And now here we've added in a background image of an airport. So it's really helping bring this to life. And now another tip for overlaying text on image that I did here is I added a gradient overlay on top of the whole slide. So I just put a rectangle over the whole slide and I made the top half of the gradient this dark gray and the bottom half of the gradient is just transparent. So what this does is that at the top there's a darker area where I can put the text over top of the darker gradient part and it really stands out. But then the lower part of the gradient is still transparent so you can see the image clearly. So just a couple tips for overlaying your text on top of images and making sure that everything is still easily read and clear for your learners. But yeah, hopefully you see how just adding in a background image totally changes the slide and really brings the scenario to life. So the background image is an important part of the scenario. And the good thing is that you can find tons of free background images online. These are easy to find. Like you shouldn't have to pay for your background images. There's tons of sites like I use stocksnap.io. Stocksnap.io is a really good site for free images. And they're completely free for use, for commercial use even. Also, Unsplash, you guys might know about Unsplash. It's also a really good site for free photos. Like 2 or 3 years ago, it was really hard to find good quality free photos, but now there's just tons of great free stock image sites coming out. So, by 2016, you shouldn't have any problems finding some really good free background images. Yes? The first one is stocksnap.io, and that's stock, STOCKSNAP, snap.io. So they have some really great photos there. Yes?
You have a lot of icons and people create things on a particular website because.
Yes?
Can you use that for commercial use or?
Yeah, absolutely. Everything that is available for download in the eLearning Heroes community is you can reuse any way you want, including commercially. And yeah, that's another place where you can go and find background images. We have background images in the download section of the eLearning Heroes community. There's tons of downloads, and they're not just product downloads. Like, you can get templates for Storyline and Studio, but there's also like icon sets and like all kinds of assets that you can use in any software. You know, if you're using PowerPoint, if you're using Captivate, you can still download a lot of the assets and use them in any tool. And there are background images there too. So the characters, you know, usually you end up having to pay for. It's hard to find free character sets. Sometimes they give away a few free poses, but the background images though should be able to find quite easily. And something that you can always do too is take your own background images, right? And that's going to be even more meaningful for your learners. If you're building a scenario for your call center folk and you take a picture of your own call center and put in the background, that's going to be really meaningful for them, right? They're going to recognize it, and it seems really custom and like it's really made just for them. So the background image is a really important part of building the scenario and bringing it to life. So a couple tips for when you're adding your background images and working with characters: scale and proportion. Do not forget scale and proportion. Notice how this character is actually 7 feet tall and taller than the door that she's standing next to. You know, not everyone's going to catch on to these little things, but a lot of people do notice these finer details, right? So unless you want to have giants in your course, just try to think about the proportion that you're using when it comes to your characters. So one way that you can fix this is, see how if I just bring her forward and chop her legs off, figuratively speaking, that kind of solves that problem. So that's one way to fix it. Or I moved her into the back and made her the right size, then it works that way too. But just remember, scale and proportion when you're adding characters on top of background images. And another thing to think about is shadows, because I know that a lot of tools let you add shadows. So if you're adding shadows to the objects on your slide, think about the image that you're working with and what the lighting is in that image, right? Like in this image, the lighting is coming from the top. So having like a shadow behind her would, you know, it just wouldn't make sense. That shadow would never happen in real life. So those are just like minor things that, you know, they might not seem like a big deal, but they're little things that can really make your course look a little bit more professional and more polished if you think about these things. And if they're not going to distract the learner, right? They're not going to be thinking about, why is there a giant with a weird shadow in this course? So just a couple of tips for when you're working with your characters and your background images. So here we are back to our template that we're building out together. You'll notice that now I've added in the background image. So this scenario is really starting to come to life. In this case, I chose a hospital hallway as my background image. And the reason for that is that I thought, like, where would the doctor be when he's calling? When he's calling to ask about this product, where would this doctor be? He would probably be in a hospital, right? So that's why I chose the hospital hallway. It might also be an office. An office background image would work well. If I had a picture of my sales rep, if I was also using my character on screen of my sales rep, then maybe a call center background would work as well. So just think about, like, what is the physical location that they're going to be in when this scenario is taking place, and then that can be your background image. Something else that I've done in the past too is that when I'm introducing the scenario, I'll put like an outside shot of the office building. So then it's like, here we are in this office building, here's an introduction to the scenario. Then when you jump in, then you're like in the office or in the call center. So it just kind of brings it all to life. It gives you an idea, this is the building they're in, this is the room that they're in. So yeah, the background images make a big, big difference. And so that is how you can set the context for your e-learning scenario. So step 5 is going to be to incorporate some realistic details into the scenario. So when I say realistic details, one of the main things that I think you should add as a detail is a little introduction to your scenario. I think it's always a good idea to give a couple of lines of text that kind of introduces what the learner's getting into. Like, instead of just jumping straight into a question or a choice, like, give them a little introduction. This doesn't mean you have to start with, like, the surgeon was born in 1951 and da-da-da-da. Like, you don't have to go that far back in time. Just like a couple of lines of, like, you're in the office, this person calls, you have the chance to make a big sale, off you go. Like just giving them a couple of lines to set them up with what's about to happen is really good for the learner. Like you never want to just send them into something without being clear about what's happening and what they're getting into. So giving a couple of lines up front that kind of gives an introduction to what's happening is an important detail that you can add into your course. And there's all kinds of other realistic details that you can add to your scenario. I always suggest trying to have whatever the parameters and details that would apply in real life, try to bring those over to your scenario. So say in real life our call center reps had access to a job aid or a reference document with all this product information. Why not give them access to that in the scenario? If they have it in real life that they can reference, might as well give them access to it in the scenario so that they can go look at it. Try to make your scenario mimic or be a reflection of the real situation as much as possible. So here in this scenario, I've added in a couple details. I added in an introduction, right? So Dr. Erickson is contacting pharma to find out more about the new product. And if you can convince him, the doctor might make a big purchase. So now we know, like, okay, we're working towards getting a big sale. Like that's what the outcome of this scenario is hopefully going to be. I also added in the name I added in that he's a doctor. Sometimes little details like that can make a big difference, right? Maybe our sales reps talk differently with a doctor customer than they do with a non-doctor customer. Maybe they use certain terminology or certain, medical jargon with the doctors that they wouldn't use with someone who isn't one. So a seemingly minor detail like that might actually have a big impact on your scenario. I also added in the name of the organization he's calling from, like maybe this is a really important client, or maybe, there's a different protocol for a certain company that's a certain size versus something else. Anyway, there could be a bunch of different, details depending on your scenario and what it is that you're building, but try to incorporate these realistic details. Can anybody think of any other details that I could add to this scenario to kind of bring it more to life even? Any ideas? Yeah? How to greet him? Sure, yeah. Any other ideas?
A specific problem that the doctor might be working on?
Yep,
Like
yep.
A patient with particular characteristics?
Yep, that's a good idea as well. Any other ideas?
Product name.
Yeah, the name of the product, good point. We might even try to find, a white lab or a stethoscope to add to our doctor just to make him look even more doctorly. So there's all kinds of details that we can add to this to make it even more rich and to make it even more realistic and meaningful for our learner. So think about those little details that you can incorporate into your scenario. And so now we move on to step 6, which is the last step in building our scenario, but a very, very important step, which is crafting our feedback. So feedback in scenarios is really important because it's an opportunity for you to show what the real life consequences would be if they made that choice that they made in the scenario. Okay, so let me show you what I mean by having feedback that illustrates real life consequences. Here I have 2 examples of feedback. Example 1, we say wrong. The correct answer is an 80% reduction of rate of infection. The second example of feedback is you've provided your customer with misinformation and the incorrect figures you've provided have caused you to lose the sale. Like which of those 2 do you think is going to be more meaningful to the learner when they get the feedback? Number 2, right? Yeah, because then you're saying, oh no, like this has caused me to lose the sale. Like that's going to have more of an impact on your learner. So try to always think about what would the real life consequences be if they made that choice, and try to incorporate that into your feedback. And something else that I try to always incorporate into the feedback is, it's not included in this example here, but I try to redirect to the right answer. I wouldn't want to just leave them hanging, without telling them what the correct choice was, because then they're never going to know, well, what was I actually supposed to do? What am I supposed to do, right? So you'd want to give them the feedback and then say something like, next time you might want to try, blah, blah, blah. So that then they know, okay, I got it wrong, but here's what I want to do. Here's the right choice. Here's what I should have done, and here's what I should do next time. So that way you don't leave your learner hanging, you give them the information that they need and you redirect them, and it becomes a teachable moment at the same time. Did you have a question?
I did. I wondered if this feedback mechanism could be used as assessment. Would there be something internal to articulate storyline that can keep a percentage of correct answers on the first try? For example,
Yeah.
give you a score or something? something?
Absolutely. You can have positive scoring or negative scoring. You can have different points depending on if they choose A, B, or C. Like one choice might be worth 3 points. One choice might be kind of right, so you might still want to give them a little bit of points. You can give them multiple attempts also. So yeah, that's all possible with Storyline anyway. So remember to use your feedback to show the real life consequences of the choice they made, and also to reiterate like the right choice and what they should do. So also, like earlier on, I mentioned how crafting your choices is probably going to be one of the harder parts of building out your scenario. Feedback is also, like choices and feedback is going to be the two like most challenging parts of building your scenario. But the thing is that it's like everything in life, it comes more easily over time. Like the first time that I ever built a scenario, I worked for this company called Langevin Learning Services. You guys may know them. They're an instructional design house. They do instructional design certification. And they wanted to turn one of their workshops, classroom workshops on training needs analysis into an e-learning module. And they were like, Nicole, turn this training needs analysis workshop into an e-learning module. And I was like, oh my God. And that was my first big scenario that I did. And I decided to do a scenario because I was like, what better way to illustrate the training needs analysis process than to actually walk them through it step by step with a fake customer, and they actually do an analysis, right? So that's the first scenario I ever built, and I struggled. Like it was hard, but it gets easier and easier over time. Like now when I get new content, I'm also automatically thinking like, what's the scenario for this? It just automatically comes to me now. And that's not to say that every single content that you're gonna get is gonna work for a scenario. That's not always the case, but I think that like 80% of the time, it's a good way to format your content for your learners. So writing the feedback is also going to be challenging, and you're probably going to want more feedback when you have a scenario, because the feedback might be different for each choice, right? Because each choice might have a different set of consequences. So you might have to spend more time crafting your feedback because there might be different feedback for each choice that they make. There might be some overlap. Some of them might be able to reuse the same feedback, but just keep in mind when you're planning, your project time, and when you're planning, how long it's going to take you to write this and develop this, keep in mind that you're going to need more feedback when you're creating a scenario. So now you can see how in the template I added in my feedback, and then I also highlighted the third box because the feedback goes with that choice. Question, yes?
I've noticed recently that some changes within different organizations, sometimes they have audio with every single word on the screen.
Yes.
When it comes to scenarios, how would you place the audio for this?
I don't typically like to do verbatim, like exactly the same word on the same words read out loud as there is on the screen. It really depends, but I think that for something like this, I might just have the narration say something, but just more elaborate than the text on screen. The text on screen could be like a more succinct version of what the narrator is saying. I don't think there's exactly a right or wrong answer. I think it just depends, on your project and, what resources you have available. But I think that people tend to not like to have the narrator saying exactly word for word what's being read on the screen. And also I try to always think like, what's the value of having, the narration here? For the feedback, I'm not sure if I would narrate. I feel like the actual scenario itself, with the customer calling in, there I can kind of see a little more value to having the narration. So I would just make sure that I can articulate a clear reason as to why it's adding value to have it.
Can I just add to that? For those of us that are familiar with her work, Ruth Clark actually has done some research against having verbatim narration going along with the text on the screen because it overtaxes the different senses. So for those of you who are familiar, I'm seeing a lot of head nods. I personally don't add audio, one because I work in a hospital situation and the audio cards have actually been removed from the computers. So for me creating scenarios, whenever I run into that conversation with leadership, I just pull up Ruth Clark's research, and that's helped me with that.
And I
Good.
practice that. The problem is the business, it's the organization, sometimes they want audio for everything.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of Ruth for 9 years, but it's this, that it's all audio for every single
Yeah.
screen. Where was this?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, yeah.
I couldn't have done that either.
So I only have 1 minute left, so I'm just going to quickly go through the branching, just to let you guys know. When we talk about branching, what it really means is just that the course hyperlinks to different slides depending on what selection a learner makes. And a model that I use for branching is the 3C model made by Tom Kuhlman. You guys may know him. He's the Rapid eLearning blog guy. I work with him at Articulate. The 3Cs is challenge, choice, and consequence. And so you see how we have our challenge, we have our choice, and we have our consequence. And even in a case like this where it's a linear set of questions, it's still really branched because you can go down different paths depending on how you select. So even if it's a linear set of questions, it can still be branched, right? So here we have another example where one of the branch ends right away, like I showed you in the interview example. If you're 30 minutes late, boom, done, branch ends. Here we have a really complex set of branching. This can work in certain cases, but just remember it's going to be a lot of work to come up with all these choices, challenges, and consequences. And you always want to think like, how far down the wrong path do I really want to let the learner go? And I think that it's usually not too far, right? You just want to let them maybe go down 1 or 2 steps down the wrong path, then redirect them and let them go through the challenge in the right way. So this is how our final scenario looks. After we've gone through all of this, we've added our background image, our characters, our choice, our challenges, our choices, our challenge. And so there we have a fully fleshed out scenario slide now. And so just to jump over the recap since I'm running out of time, but I just want to know, now that we've been through this, who here feels confident designing a scenario for e-learning after having attended this session? Good. I see a lot more hands now. I'm really happy to hear that. So if you guys want to get in touch with me after, I'm on Twitter, I'm on LinkedIn, I have a blog called Flirting with eLearning. I'm in the eLearning Heroes community writing content every week. So yeah, if you have other questions, feel free to come and chat with me afterwards. I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.